Yes.
Eriol, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
I'm gonna give you a little intro. So Eriol is a designer from UK Bristol. She found herself the most happy when she worked as a part of the team with designers and other product developers and specialists. And this talk, Eriol is going to share workshops she did with open design all around the world, from Taipei, India, and Kenya, to design open source tech tools for humanitarian purpose, and how to encourage engage designers to open source communities. So without further ado, let's welcome Eriol Fox.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear some voices and hear some clapping as well, because so often when you do talks over the internet now, you don't actually get to hear the people that are listening. So thank you for inviting me to talk about open source design and the Open Design Project. Like Julia said, this is a talk about some of the things that we learned over the last 2 years of working on open source humanitarian technology to engage designers in that process. So these are designers that have no real prior knowledge of open source software. So I'm Eriol, I use they, them pronouns. I've been in the design space, the design industry, for about 10 years now, and that was in commercial and proprietary and for-profit software before I moved into humanitarian work and non-profit work. So I've also been in the humanitarian space and the non-profit space for about 7 years, and really only in open source software and FLOSS software for the last 2 years, really. So I'm actually quite new to open source software. I'm starting a PhD next year in January, researching the intersection and the engagement between humanitarian open source software and design at Newcastle University. And I recently joined the Open Food Network as their lead designer. They create an e-commerce platform for farmers and producers to sell their products that's fully open source as well. So when I joined an organization that was open source, which was a few years ago now, this was my first organization that was truly embracing open source software as their core part of what they deliver as a service, as tools. And before then, I'd only really heard about open source software when I'd spoken to developers that I was working with. I'd maybe knew a little bit about open source software and why it existed, what it was used for, and how developers learned about different languages or different tools and used different frameworks or different tools when they were creating the software that they create wherever they work. But when I joined this open source organization, making open source tools, I was watching developers from around the world contributing to our open source software alongside our developers that were paid to work on the open source software. And I was really curious as to why there weren't designers also contributing to the open issues that we had that were around design for the open source tools that we were creating. So I was talking to the other designer that I was working with at the time, and we had this big question: why aren't there many design-related contributions to open source? Because we looked around at other open source tools, and there was maybe a few tools that engaged with designers, the Mozilla Open Design Project and simple.org, and a few other tools and organizations that encourage design contribution, but no large groups of designers contributing like what you see in the development community. So we got together with a couple of other organizations. We started working with 2 other organizations to tackle this question, research this question, and try and explore it. And those organizations were a global design agency called Designit that do a lot of design work on lots of different products globally, and the proprietary commercial software organization Adobe. They were really curious to understand better how they can help designers, even if they're using the commercial tools that Adobe use, how they could encourage designers to learn about open source software and contribute. So together, these organizations, alongside my previous employer, which was an organization called Ushahidi, making humanitarian open source tools, created a project called Open Design. And together we were researching and trying out new things. And the first things that we tried out as pilots were 2 workshops, one in Berlin in 2018 and one in Seattle in 2019. What we were doing here was testing whether you could introduce open source software to a group of designers at an event and have a real contribution after the workshops, whether the designers would understand the purpose of the open source software, what kinds of questions they had, what kinds of challenges they had working with open source tools, and also what kind of support, resources and structure they needed for a kind of workshop or a hackathon that ultimately wanted a contribution to the open source after the workshop or during the workshop. And the main thing that we learned after these workshops, these pilot workshops, alongside many other things that we learned, was that designers, wherever they're from, whether they're working commercially in for-profit companies or whether they're already working on projects that are for good, really still want to contribute their skills, time and expertise on projects that do good. And one of the main challenges that I had in these workshops around open source tools is that Ushahidi had a really clear humanitarian purpose. It made a tool that we were working on for crisis communication in natural disasters and human-made disasters. And the designers found that really easy to understand. Okay, well, we don't really know about this open source part, but we know that we want to help people in crises communicate better. So, you know, we'll help you in that. We can see that that's for good and humanitarian. But one of the key things that I want to encourage now with the workshop is that open source generally is for good by the nature of it being open and shareable and remixable, so you can fork repositories, learn your own, create your own versions. You can share a lot, and you know, open source is the basis of a lot of the open web. By that fact, most open source you could say is for good. It has a for good purpose out in the world. It's the basis of how we use the internet, use the web, and progress on the web. And this is a harder thing to explain to designers, but it's still there. It's still there for good. So after coming back together as 3 organizations after these pilot workshops and what we'd learned, we decided to move forward with this statement for the next set of workshops, which is designers collaborating and contributing to humanitarian open source software and tech for good at challenge gatherings. And we also wanted to analyze the process as we were going along and make sure that the way that we were sharing our findings was also fully open source as well. But there were a lot of different challenges in the research phase of redesigning these workshops to incorporate the things that we learned. And there's not enough time today to go into depth on all of them, but I'm going to cover some of the main challenges about how designers, the challenges that designers have when they start to think about contributing to open source.
Yeah. Sorry, Eriol. I just realized that we are not seeing your slide. Do you mind to change the setting a little bit? Because we only sees your speaker's screen. Is that possible? Or it's because we can hear you clearly, perfect.
Can you see them now?
Not really. It's okay. Let's take a few minutes to figure it out.
So it's
no worries.
I'm presenting my entire screen. Screen number 2. It might be because I've got a second screen.
Yeah, it's okay, because we can hear you clearly, perfectly.
Sure.
I think, let's see.
Interesting. Let me see if presenting my main screen helps with this. So, okay. So let's do present the entire screen one. Can you see them now? Oh. Julia?
这样是好一点。Now we can, huh? 拼这个画面，要怎么拼？就这样就可以吗？I think now it's fine. You just need to use a full screen mode.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just one second, because I just need to switch my display around to this.
Yeah.
And hopefully, no. Because when I present now, you're going to see my notes instead of the main presentation. Just 2 seconds while I look at my preferences.
No worries.
I can change that. And okay. This is always the way with technology, isn't it? Sometimes.
I know, it was all fine when we rehearsed, and of course,
right.
Murphy's Law. we rehearsed that twice before, so it was totally fine. Anyway, so it's just like experience.
How about? No, this isn't going to work either very well. I might be able to do that, and then this might work. I think. Is that okay? So you should see things full screen now.
No, it's
oh no.
No. Why don't we
Wait.
Yeah.
One last thing. Okay, so I need to reshare. Okay.
Actually, if it's easier for you to just show what's earlier, then that's fine. If we don't see the full screen, we can still see your slide.
I think
there you go. Yeah.
Okay, we got there.
All right. Sorry, you can
continue
now. Thank you.
Thank you for telling me. I'd rather you be able to see the slides than not. But just be aware that I'm working without notes now, but it should be fine. So as I was saying, there's lots of different challenges involved when you're working with designers in the open source space, and these are just some of them. So the first challenge is that most designers don't really have a clue about what open source software is or can be. So this is the issue that I was referencing a little bit earlier around how they really understand when there's a clear humanitarian purpose, like with the tools that we were working on with the workshop. They could understand it was a product that wanted to do crisis communication, but the open source part was harder for them to kind of grasp, harder for them to understand. And a lot of designers tend to think of open source software, when you mention it in that term, they tend to think of things like the Linux operating system, or they immediately think of things like the terminal, or they might think of things like developer tools and things like that. But most designers really don't understand or really are clear about what open source is, or even what it could be. So this is like about projects, or content, or design systems even, or UI frameworks that can be open source as well. So the open source isn't just about developer tools, it's about all different things that can be open source under a open source license. The next challenge is that open source software really isn't part of design education. So when we do either formal or informal education, so in school and university, or just learning ourselves in our spare time, it's really not included in any of the study materials. This is changing a little bit. There are a few universities now that include open source software modules where you work on a design project specifically around an open source principle. But even if designers in school or out of school learning themselves are using open source software, like say maybe to work on some front-end projects or any other design projects that might use an open source software tool, they still don't really know or don't get the detail of what open source software is as part of their education. So if they learn about it, it's through experiencing conversations with developers, it's through maybe the communities online, but usually designers that are interested in open source software either come from a art development background, or they happen to have a conversation about open source software with somebody that already knows about it. There's a connected issue around the education, that if we are not teaching open source software and the contributions to open source software for designers as part of our education, then when it comes to hiring, the companies that also don't know about open source software are going to look at a designer's CV or a portfolio and be really confused about open source software. Why is this here? We've not seen this before. So how is a designer who wants to participate in open source software and contributions to it to grow their learning and to expand their projects as part of their portfolio and their CV, if they then get to the interview stage for a design job in a design firm or a design company and find that the people that they're being interviewed by also don't know about that, we've got a problem that's not only from the beginning of education, it's right towards like sustained learning throughout the whole of your design career, really. So really complicated problem around staying engaged with the education of open source in the design industry. The next challenge is about the interfaces that we use for open source software. So even if designers know about open source software, they really struggle when the first place to go find these projects to contribute on are places like GitHub and GitLab. So often designers don't really use these places very often for our projects. It's not a place where we're in daily, like maybe many developers are daily working in these places on the code, or maybe through the terminal that they access these projects. But designers are not regularly using these places, these websites, these places to store projects. And so when you say, oh, the place to find all these cool projects to contribute to is GitHub and GitLab, they get really nervous and think that they really need to know everything that there is about using GitHub and GitLab and the terminal to be able to even contribute to small issues or small design contributions. And then they start getting worried about needing to do pull requests and needing to raise issues and all the different things that we often take for granted that we already know about contributing to open source software when we've engaged with projects before. So even if they know these places where to find the open source software projects, they really need some support in getting past the first few barriers to understand what the projects are doing and how to contribute. And this really is about the first step is to make your README and your documentation really friendly towards designers. And I've got some great tips about that we can talk about after the talk if you're curious. The next challenge is that when you're talking to most open source software projects as a designer, they will say when you're like, I want to contribute design to your open source software, they immediately usually think of logos and graphics. And if you're lucky, the open source software project will be interested in user interface or UI, or maybe even design systems or UI frameworks. But this is a really hard problem, because that's not everything that design as a function and as an industry has to offer. There's lots of things like user testing and user research and user experience design and interaction design, and lots of things that designers can do to contribute to open source software projects. And this is a interesting challenge, because it's the same within open source projects, in that there's a lot of terms and jargon and words that we use that designers struggle to learn and understand. But also in design, we have jargon and words and terms that we use that we know because that's what we've always used. So one of the things that we need to do here is a better sharing of our process, of our terminology, and the words that we use to describe different things that we do as designers or as developers, and start working collaboratively a lot more than sharing the activities that we do to contribute and explaining them clearly. The next challenge is kind of a complicated one. So this is about how we word open source software project issues and how they can be really restrictive. And this comes from a point of view where maybe a designer has actually gotten into the issue list and they're looking for something to work on, but all they see are issues that are talking about the coding language that something is being worked in, a feature that needs to be built in PHP, or a bug that is coming up in one part of the code. And there's no issues and no broadening of a problem or a bug that might be something that designers can contribute to. So sometimes when we're writing our issues for, say, features, or even writing issues to tackle different bugs, if we can open up the kind of description of those issues that isn't just purely technical, then you can have designers read these issues and maybe come up with an idea that actually solves the problem in a different way than perhaps the code or the technical aspects of things. So being able to open up issues and stop them from being restricted just to the technical problems that are being experienced in the open source is really, really key to including designers in the conversation. On the other side of this argument is that when you do very open workshops or very open issues for designers, so an example might be you have an issue where, say, our login and register page is not great and we'd like a designer to look at it. It's too broad and it loses focus and it loses relevancy. So what you really need to do is balance between restrictive technical issues and really open and broad issues where designers really struggle to get to the focused problem and solve that focused problem. There's something in design called design fiction, and this is when the work that we are asked to do is so broad that we might come up with examples or solutions that are so fictional or not real, not grounded in reality, that it's not even anywhere near implementable by the actual technology. Technology might not exist to create what we've designed, or it just might not be feasible with an open source project full of volunteers contributing the code. The next problem is around version control, and this is a tricky problem because we kind of don't really have a process or a software for version control with design. If a designer decides to work on a project or on a product, they don't really know if another designer working in the same product or project is working on the same interface or the same problem, because our software doesn't tell us when there's a conflict. There's no like merging of design branches. And the best way that we can do version control as designers at the moment is to have conversations, synchronous or asynchronous conversations about what we're working on and whether there are conflicts. And this tends to take a long time. And also that process of conversation is not something that designers are used to either. A lot of us are used to working solo. So the idea of collaborating so that we don't have merge conflicts with the design is also really, really tricky. So it has to be something that we teach designers more about. And one of the things that's really exciting about open source design is there are more and more tools that are being created to tackle this, that are layers upon things like GitHub or that work within our design software. So there's amazing and interesting stuff that's happening in this space, specifically around version control.
Yeah, Eriol, just a heads up, you got about 5 to 10 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to speed through some of these slides to get to the workshops that we did and some more learnings. But we reworked the workshop after learning all these things. And we included 5 different design activities, which are on the screen right now, in these workshops that were accessible to all levels of designers usually, and also non-designers. So these are great things to add into your open source repositories as issues, these activities, which are empathy mapping, define the problems, ideation, storyboarding, and prototyping. And then we did 2 workshops to test our new framework. We did one in India, in Bangalore, and one in Taipei, in Taiwan. We used Ushahidi's open source product that does crisis communication. And in India, we focused on flooding as a problem statement. And in Taipei, Taiwan, we focused on typhoons and hurricanes that were affecting farmers in rural areas as our problem statement. And there are 2 key things that I just want to talk about that are really important when you're running a workshop on, or even like involving designers remotely, not just a workshop, on your open source software when you want to include designers. And the first one is to include into the whole process of designing solutions for design problems in your open source software is to invite a witness. So somebody that knows the problem that your open source software is trying to solve. So in our case, these were people with experience of flooding in India and typhoons and hurricanes in Taiwan. So we had a person in India that has done research with an organization around the flooding and worked with the communities there. Her name was Akila. And we had 2 founders of a NGO and a farmer that was suffered from the hurricanes and typhoons in Taipei. They founded an organization called Go Honor, and they were there throughout the whole workshop process to be the people that we looked to validate the solutions that we were coming up with. So it's so important to include these expert witnesses in your design, open source design process. The next thing is to translate your design, to translate your issues that are maybe worded very technically into design challenges. And there's an example from the GitHub repository on how to do that on the screen right now. And on the previous slide, there's an example on how to refill witness for a project as well. But the translating issue really is about taking those technically worded challenges, technically worded issues, and translating them into design-friendly language. It can be explored by multiple different designers working together, ideally, on that one problem. So those are the key things that we took away from the workshops that we have time for today. The last thing that I want to say is that designers really respond well when they give a tangible contribution at the end of their workshop or during their process of engaging with an open source software, like developers. So there's a real great feeling that comes from merging your first pull request. And for designers, it needs to be similar, but it's more about contributing something tangible from a design point of view. And we focus on prototypes, like physical, visual prototypes as the thing. And these are the aims of open design going forward: increasing and sustaining contribution, supporting the community, building understanding, and bringing it to the education system workplace. And we want to build more relationships with more open source projects. If you're curious and are interested in open design workshops or your open source projects and tools, please get in contact with me. And here is the open repository for forcing and taking a look at all the different research and frameworks that we use for open design. And this really is the future of how designers and developers collaborate together, whether it's on open source software or whether it's on commercial or proprietary software. And it's a key thing for designers to learn that this is really the future of the design community and industry. There's also a great join our community of supportive designers interested in open source. We have a forum, and we also have a job page where you can post your open source software projects and the tasks or the issues that you are interested in designers helping on. Take a look at opensourcedesign.net. And finally, just a thank you, and for being patient with the technical issues.
All right, let's open for Q&A on the live audience here. Is anybody have any questions? Anybody has any questions? I'm gonna ask you one question. So I know designer, we have graphic designers and also UI and UX. So does that make UI and UX easier to access to all open source project than the graphic designer, since the graphic designer now is more like have to involve with UI and UX most of the time these days?
I think you find both want to contribute as much as the other, actually. So I see plenty of designers that are doing UX and UI interested in contributing to open source, as well as graphic designer, logo designers, visual designers, illustrators as well, want to contribute illustrations or graphics. I think that there is something that feels more easy or simple with a logo project. Like, logos are quite easy to sort of describe what you might want, and it's easy to see the results a lot of the time. If there's anything that's visual, logos, icons, illustrations, buttons, lots of these things are easy because there's something visual at the end, and it's reasonably quick compared to something like UX and UI that takes, especially with UX, takes some research time. So I think that there's not less of UI and UX, or it's not harder to do UI or UI and UX and open source. It takes longer, and there's not a kind of very easy to see or visual output unless you have prototypes or like a document of user research with recommendations on what to improve about the open software product. I think it's more about the output of the design task more than anything else. It's just a little bit harder to see the results of UI and UX sometimes.
All right, thanks for your great presentation. I think, is there any more questions? It's very surprising. I thought UI and UX were, because they know more about tech stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you so much, Eriol.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of your conference. If you're interested in any of these topics, please reach out to me. I am really, really happy to answer any questions, have conversations, and just know that there are loads of designers out there that are really, really interested in contributing to your project, like genuinely want to contribute to your project, but they just don't know how to get there yet, and they just need a little bit of help. That's the main thing to take away.
Yeah. I believe your slide is gonna be, and then recording is gonna be uploaded to COSCUP. And so if anybody have any, want to research more about Eriol's project and open design, COSCUP is the way to go, and we will have links somewhere, and then we'll post on the Facebook page. So thank you so much, Eriol. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.